Welcome to another exciting edition of Blogging Heads. I am Ezra Klein here with Peter Suderman. How's it going, Peter?
Hey, it's going very well, Ezra.
So today we are in a post-New Hampshire, post-Iowa, early 2008 mode, so we're going to do a lot of presidential politics. As is everybody, it will be probably unilluminating, I fear, as all this commentary is, but we live in D.C. and have no choice whatsoever. But we're going to begin with the New Hampshire polls, which are roiling, if that's the right word. A lot of the people I know who are actual pollsters who follow this sort of data, they're very, very upset because they got it so wrong. In the polling in advance of the New Hampshire election, the New Hampshire primary, Barack Obama was 8.3% ahead on average. He did not finish 8.38% ahead. He finished 11 points below that, which, given that statistical sampling is supposed to get it pretty nearby, that's not a good thing. So some folks are wondering whether this was a Bradley Wilder effect, which is when the support for black candidates is understated, is overstated in polling. It isn't that they get fewer votes than they were supposed to, but that all votes then break for the white candidate. Others are wondering if this was a function of the final 2 days of Hillary Clinton coverage, where she got angry at the debate and showed some real sort of passion and then choked up in an interview. But what I want to know, I think the big question is, what does Peter Suderman think?
Well, I find Andrew Kohut's explanation very convincing. He wrote a piece in the New York Times arguing that the real problem here is not the Bradley effect, was not the reporting on Hillary Clinton over the last couple of days. It was instead that poorer, less educated white voters tend not to respond to pollster questions, period. They simply decline to respond, and so it makes it very difficult to figure out how they're going to vote. And then when they do turn out in big numbers, as seems to have been the case in New Hampshire, it becomes it can skew the results pretty significantly. So I think that's fairly convincing. I mean, as far as pollsters go, you can't really go wrong with Andrew Kohut. He's the one of the head pollsters for NPR, and he does a lot for Pew as well. So I think that's a reasonably convincing argument. The thing that sort of interested me with the problems with the polls was that. Coming out of this, you had a whole bunch of sort of concerned journalists. One of the reporters from McClatchy said something to NPR to the effect that reporters and journalists are abusing polls and shouldn't be talking about polls in advance, and they treat them as far too predictive. And what I wondered is, do you think that is the case? Do we obsess over polls too much? And does the media? We're going to talk about the media as a singular entity. Does the media use polls properly? Is there some other way that you think they should be using them?
I'm going to actually back you up because I didn't find the Kohut piece, which I thought was interesting, as convincing as you did. So Kohut, as you said, argues that what you had was an issue where working class, downscale white voters don't respond to polling. Fair enough. What he wasn't able to explain, what he didn't even attempt to explain, is why that didn't happen in Iowa. So you could argue, as some have, there's a caucus effect, where when you have to cast your vote in front of your peers, you don't change over. But I don't think anybody would have considered you a racist for voting for John Edwards or Hillary Clinton, or caucusing for John Edwards or Hillary Clinton. And the other thing, which I found very, very interesting, is that the big difference between Iowa and New Hampshire was gender gap. It was that in Iowa, Barack Obama won an equal percentage of men and women. And in New Hampshire, Hillary Clinton romped him, just stomped him among women and lost men badly. I mean, and the actual number is instructive here. In New Hampshire, Hillary Clinton won 46% of women and 29% of men. It was a huge difference right there. So right. I think that is actually the salient difference, much more so than the numbers among downscale whites. Like, what you really saw change was that Hillary Clinton won different demographics that broke evenly for Obama in Iowa. So I don't know that Kohut is so on the mark, although I have no doubt either that what he's saying explains a part of it. I would, as for whether or not we overuse polling, I mean, hugely. But I think the issue is much less whether or not we overuse polling in the days leading up to an election. which is more what's being talked about with New Hampshire, because theoretically that does give you an accurate snapshot of the race. But what I hate about the way the media uses polling is what they do long before an election. The way they allow polling to set their narrative for the election. The way they, in the age of 24-hour news, in the age of, magazines and blogs, how every bit of data just barely goes to sate the giant appetite for content that we have. And so polling, even if it shows nothing new, even if what it shows is very inconclusive, gets brought up again and again and again as objective fact, and because we keep talking about it. And because we look at a poll and impose a storyline on it, Hillary Clinton is above by 20 points, so here's why. Here's why she's a front runner. We cement in whatever's being shown on the poll. We take a poll, which is a snapshot of reality, and then convince people as to why that is the right reality. Why that reality is based on objective forces and fact and all the rest of it. It, in a way, makes us part of the poll. It, in a way, makes us partially responsible for continually reifying the results there. I think it's a very dangerous and much more to the point, unilluminating way to cover politics. I mean, there are real problems with the sort of coverage I do, which is much more normative. Here's how it should be. Here's what I think is going on. Here's what I think is going wrong. Here's why I think Hillary Clinton deserves her lead, why Obama deserves to fail, deserves to rise, why John Edwards deserves more votes than he's got. And that's all got a real problem to it. I mean, nobody's going to accuse me of objectivity anytime soon. But the other side of it, where you're sort of slavishly devoted to whatever the present moment appears to look like, when you're slavishly devoted to whatever the conventional wisdom currently is, that has its own set of problems, and all the more so because journalists refuse to identify that as a worldview and a real set of effects, and instead insist on pretending that when you just tell people again and again and again what is going on, and sort of explain why what is going on is the only thing that really could be going on and is the right thing to be going on, that in fact you're taking no position. But what that really is an endorsement of the status quo.
I agree with you that it is taking a position. I'm not so sure that that is a bad thing. We live in an era of 24-hour news and up-to-the-minute blogs and the whole thing. And there's so much information coming in, and there are so many people who have a responsibility all day long to simply come up with something to say, to come up with some sort of story to tell, to generate a narrative. So why not? What else are they going to use? They're going to, and if not polls, then there was a Daniel Engberg piece in Slate that suggested that, well, if we didn't have polls, we'd have something else. We'd have the futures markets, and sort of telling us what to think. We'd have whatever it is. We'd have something there, and so there's going to be some sort of narrative. Why not polls?
I'm not saying why not polls first. I'm just saying that I think that's bad. Like what you're talking about right there. That there's always going to be, you have a Say's Laws effect, right? There's so much supply of content delivery. There's so much news air time with 4 or 5 24-hour news networks. There's so much magazine, so much blog. But that's the problem, that with that much time to fill, we begin overfilling it. We overweight things like polls or whatever would replace polls. And it just creates, I'm not saying I know how to fix it. God knows I don't. But it's creating
the media actually needs is to decline and get smaller here, and we need to cover these things. No, I'm kidding.
Or focus on other things and fire you and I.
I don't know. I just think there's so much of a desire within sort of the American populace, or certainly a large segment of it, for storytelling and for people don't look to news because news gives them real information that impacts their lives, especially political news. I mean what Obama's doing in June of 2007, a year and a half before the election and 6 months before any primary starts, that doesn't really affect the lives of the vast majority of people who are watching that news. So what they're watching it for is a story. They just want a story to be told. You can look at news as sort of something that has responsibility and provides some sort of social utility. And I think there's obviously an argument for that. But on the other hand, it's also just entertainment. It's storytelling. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and wrong with just having storytelling and trying to come up with a sort of a narrative and a framework that explains the moment, and then sort of proceeding with that. And especially since it obviously there's obviously a market for it, and there's obviously people out there who want it, who are going to seek it out no matter what. So why shouldn't we have reporters and journalists and talking heads on TV and bloggers all over the place who get busy telling these stories and who enjoy and do well telling them?
Well, I think you are totally correct to say that what news is not information, but entertainment. It's news-ertainment. There's a great line. You a George Saunders fan at all?
Not so much.
Not so much. He's got this great new book called The Dumb Megaphone, or the Brain Dead Megaphone. It's a book of essays, and in it, he's got an essay on the media. And he says that we have asked, there are two ways to look at the news, that please tell us as much truth as you can, and please tell us as much truth as you can while turning a profit, and the two are not the same. And I think it's a good point. What you're saying is completely correct. The news is entertainment. It is telling a story. It is trying to grab viewers. I mean, I go on Hardball a lot, which is a pretty different vibe than doing this show with you, and I'm just always amazed at how much...
I could interrupt you every 3 or 4 seconds if that would help.
Huh? Right. It makes me feel a lot more comfortable. I'm just amazed always when I'm on there at... It isn't just about telling the story, but creating conflict. I mean, just information isn't part of the equation. You can try to get in your little bits of wonkery, at almost like rap speed if you feel like it. But, it's got its problems, and Hardball's no worse than any other. They're all the same like that. I mean, unless you're going on C-SPAN. So you're totally right in what the objective of the news is. And this is true, across a lot of sectors. There's a great line in Bill Buford's book on Mario Batali's restaurant, his book Heat, where Batali says, listen, like what we do at a restaurant is we bring in ingredients and we try to sell them at a higher rate. We're not, and if we can make a fine culinary adventure in a little way, so be it, or all the better. So, and I'm not arguing with any of that. That's obviously, the way we're doing things here, but I think oftentimes it's bad, and it creates... we are telling a story, but we're telling a story about real life. And we're telling a story about how to interpret real life, and then how to approach real life. You just had a very weird election, right, or a very weird primary on the Democratic side, where you had 3 frontrunners, Edwards, Clinton, and Obama, none of whom, aside for Clinton sort of, but she won in 2006, had been more than a one-term senator in the United States Senate, all of whom had... done most of their terms during a Republican presidency, which is to say that they carried out their terms during a period when they couldn't enact any real legislation, which is why you have this odd theory of change thing running through the Democratic election. None of them were an executive. None of them passed any remarkable legislation, so they can't argue that they really brought any change. All they can do is argue for why they have a plausible theory of how to do it in the future. Below them, you had Bill Richardson, who I have my deep problems with, and Joe Biden and Chris Dodd, all of whom had really done a lot. They'd really done a lot. And Chris Dodd and Biden, I thought, are real talented campaigners. I mean, talented on the level, I would argue, certainly of Hillary Clinton, but even of John Edwards. And had the media, from the day Chris Dodd came in, told a story about how Chris Dodd was going to be a really serious contender to the crown, I think he would have been. But we decided not to do that, or we didn't do that. I don't know where the decision is made, or if it is, or if it's, how exactly that mechanism breaks down. And so Chris Dodd's candidacy, which was a very viable candidacy by a charismatic, well-experienced, and innovative and a very effective politician, never got off the ground. Never even got a couple inches off the ground. And I think, and I'm not saying that I don't know how the other way to do it would have been, but I think that we need to recognize that was in large part a function of the media saying, creating a very set storyline on the Democratic side, of which there was no room for new characters to walk on stage.
On the other hand, you're arguing here for sort of a vision of a very, very, not just powerful, but controlling media. One that doesn't just have the power to sort of report and sort of generate ideas and frameworks, but one that sort of has the power to say who's going to win, or at least provide a whole lot of the sort of the backing and sort of the lay the groundwork for who's going to win. And maybe they only pick, well, it's going to be one of these 3. And I'm not sure I buy that. I think there's plenty of reason to believe that sometimes the media doesn't get what it wants, that sometimes their storylines don't play out just as the sort of the Washington, D.C. journalist cohort want it to. And that there are people making their own decisions and who are not simply sort of tools of the media here. I think it can feel like that here in D.C. if you're working in politics and you walk into the office every day and you've already read the front page of the New York Times and listened to NPR on your way to work, and then you spend 4 hours reading blogs, a couple of hours talking to people, and and then the evening watching news. But most people don't have that sort of that sort of interaction with the news media that we do and that most of the people that we know do. And so I'm not sure that it really has the influence that a lot of people in this area like to impugn to it.
Well, I'd say two things, right? One is that I'm not arguing for that media. As I said, I don't have a better way to do it. I don't know. I mean, I'm doing the traditional media thing here in carping. But I would say that what I want is not the media with that power, but the media to recognize that it already has and wields that power. And I feel like it would be better if we were more self-reflective about it, because I feel like the way we hide behind this concept of objectivity, as if it was anything we could ever achieve, allows us to simultaneously do that, control those narratives or have a major impact on them, and pretend we aren't, which I think is somewhat more dangerous than at least, than a free-for-all partisan press in which, people are at least being honest about where they're coming from, or, other ways of doing that where as I said, I don't really have the answer to it. I wouldn't profess to say that I've got the solution here, but I think that what we are doing is pretending that we are something we're not, and that makes it more dangerous. And I want to say, too, that you're completely right on the idea that the media does not control everything, or even near it. I mean, I was in the audience back in 2003 when Howard Dean went out at the Democratic Convention in California and gave that, remarkable speech about what I want to know about the Democratic Party. And here's this guy. The media certainly did not create Howard Dean. He was an organic phenomena. So is Ron Paul. So is Mike Huckabee. So are many, many more. One of the truths about the Democratic primary was that there wasn't a whole lot of space for Chris Dodd and Joe Biden because Democrats were pretty enamored with their top three choices. So that was part of it, too. But I think both, the media and obviously other factors all have a role. And so far as the media's role goes, I think that much of it is problematic, and problematic in ways we attempt to deny and so never have to think about how to fix. And if we did have to think about how to fix, I trust there'd be smarter people than me who could maybe figure it out. But I think that's a good lead into what we were thinking about talking about, which was Edwards and the South, and Edwards and populism, which I don't know if you want to begin on, or I can, depending on what you feel.
Well, I do think it's interesting, the exit polls that have shown that Edwards has done better, even though Edwards is sort of, we generally can agree that Edwards is the most progressive of the three leading Democratic candidates. Edwards has done better with the more conservative voters. And the general explanation for this has been that Edwards, as a white male with a Southern drawl and sort of a Southern manner, has sort of convinced voters, a certain subset of voters, that he is the most conservative candidate. And I think you had a post up that argued that what voters vote on is cues rather than on policy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's absolutely right, and although I might go even further and say that often they don't even vote on cues. They're voting on who knows what. They don't know why they're making decisions. And if you look at there was a post by Dana Goldstein at Taft, and then there was this.
He's just sitting in a cubicle 20 feet to my left.
Right. On some of her experiences with talking to undecided voters and her complete inability to get them to be able to explain why they're voting the way they do, or sort of they have sentiments they do. A couple of years back, there was a really wonderful Chris Hayes article in the New Republic, in which he talked about the undecided voter and going out to campaign and to talk to voters and to try and figure out why they think the way they do. And he was just sort of shocked at the fact that, as he said, some of them didn't even understand the concept of issues. Not just that they didn't know what the issues were, or didn't know how they felt about them, or couldn't provide statistics or anything like that. It was that they did not understand what an issue was, and what was actually at play when you're talking, when we're discussing politics. And so this is something, again, that I think a lot of Beltway folks who are sort of mired in this and buried in sort of political coverage and political talk and political, and discussions, and every bar is, sort of an opportunity to have a debate, and every morning is, just sort of nothing but reading news and writing and discussion. We forget that for the vast majority of people, they just don't have this level of interaction with news and with information. As Chris described it in his article, that for a lot of people, they sort of understand that there's a responsibility to do politics, but it's like doing the laundry. And I think that sort of that's very accurate, and it sort of it renders a lot of what we do and a lot of the policy debates sort of useless, and some not useless, but it gives them a limited utility anyway in a lot of ways, and we've got to sort of figure out, well, what does that mean for political coverage, and what does that mean for policy analysis? You wrote when you came back from New Hampshire that there's no way to cover a campaign from the perspective of a voter, which I think was very
perceptive. From the voters, not just to be clear.
From the voters in general,
voter mind,
and we don't know what that is, and we don't, and it's this sort of impossible thing to figure out is, what are they in general thinking? Polls can tell us some things, but as we have discussed, they can't tell us a lot of whys. They can tell us sort of generally what people think, but not a lot about why.
We're going to put that Chris Hayes article, by the way, from the New Republic on the sidebar. I recommend that all of you people in Blogging Heads land read it. It's a really, really good piece. I'll say a couple things on Edwards. Number one, I think there was, particularly in retrospect, a bit of an incoherence at the center, at the heart of the case for John Edwards, which was that a lot of the progressives who supported him had the idea that here's this smooth-talking, drawling Southerner, white male, who was running on a genuinely progressive, generally hard-edged liberal platform. And that the great advantage of that was that voters would look at him and see a moderate. The cues that John Edwards gave off, he was sort of nice sounding, they would look at him and see a moderate, and so he would be able to get support from people who wouldn't normally support his agenda. And I think that there was a sort of both a condescension and a smugness in that, and it went like this, that's true for the conservative Democrats who are dumber, but the liberal Democrats, they're smarter, and they're going to know. And there's going to be this asymmetry of information in the primary, where only the liberal Democrats would know that John Edwards agreed with them. And what turned out to be the case was that wasn't true. That just wasn't true. The conservative Dems did exactly what these folks said they would do, and then the liberal Democrats didn't. They didn't think John Edwards was that liberal. They thought that he was, sort of an old-style populist, whatever they believed. I mean, as to jump off your comment on the voters and give another Chris Hayes line, the voter's mind is a black box at the center of American politics, and we don't know how to access it. It's a really good point. But Edwards had that problem. He did come off in exactly the way he was touted to do, and when that happened, it turned out that you couldn't do it only to one. You could fool all of the electorate all the time, but not some of the electorate all of the time. Which is to say, he couldn't fool just half of it. And so he got the conservative voters, but not the liberal ones. I'll just say though that one thing about the policy platforms is that it's interesting that there are different levels to effect. One level is the voters, but another level is the politicians and the think tankers and on and on. And Edwards had, I think, a remarkable and a huge and important effect on the race. He made it much more liberal. I think he's a real reason we had so much positive discussion of universal health care. He was first out with a good global warming bill. He had a huge impact, just enormous. But it was all at the elite level. He had a big impact on the other candidates who realized that they had to run to the left because if they didn't, he would be there and he would slaughter them from it. If he was the only guy with a universal health care plan, if he was the only guy who wanted to bring troops out of Iraq, if he were the only guy with a good global warming plan. And, he did a lot for elites. He made it seem like progressivism may be a real attractive force and an attractive vein of votes in this election. But on the actual voter level, he didn't have anywhere near that impact. And it's interesting to sort of being in Washington, but also knowing a bit about these other campaigns, how many cues they took from him on the theory that the voters would take the same cues. Oftentimes it seems to me that Washington exists as a sort of shared deception, that my writing matters because a lot of other people believe my writing matters, but if everybody just ignored my writing, it wouldn't matter. Insofar as it, and the impact, even with the deception of my particular pieces, are small, so don't get me wrong. But that deception almost allows everything to work, because you need that sort of discussion among, sort of informed, policy-oriented elites, and if everybody were just going to be really honest about how much it matters, what David Ignatius writes in the Washington Post, then nobody would care. But it's good that politicians, or sometimes good that politicians think they need to worry about criticism from David Ignatius.
I would agree with a lot of what you said. Certainly, Edwards deserves credit from a progressive perspective for pushing the race to the left and for pushing the other candidates to the left. Obama and Clinton were as progressive, I think, as they were in large part because he showed them that not only could they, but they should in order to appeal to a lot of the Democratic voters. On the other hand, let me say that I think that some of the conventional wisdom was correct in that Edwards would have probably run pretty well in a national election, and somewhat differently. I think he would have put certainly he would have changed the debate in a lot of the South. And a lot of those Southern cues and those conservative cues that you talk about would have played pretty well there. In the same way, I think that that those cues are playing relatively well from Mike Huckabee, who appeals has a similar appeal in a lot of ways. He's less angry and he's less sort of forthright in a lot of what he talks about. But he has a there's some overlap in their appeal. Anyway, I'll just say that. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of the voters in the South who are conservatives, quote unquote, are supporting Huckabee, who is not a super conservative politician, and they're doing it because of the cues. And so I think a lot of them would have been able to sort of open their minds to Edwards and take a look at him in a way that they're less likely to with Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama.
I mean, I don't know. This is one of those times when the black box of the electorate comes into play. Like, would John Edwards, after a couple months in the national spotlight, be just the guy with the haircut, the hedge fund, and the big house? I don't know, but
sure, there would have been plenty of that, but I can't base this on anything other than the fact that I grew up in the South. I recently returned there, and sometimes
Where are you from?
I'm from North Florida, the Panhandle of Florida, which is functionally southern Alabama, and every time I go back, when you're sort of in it and around it, you forget how honestly different a lot of the South is from the rest of the country. And then when you but then when you're out of it for a long time and you go back, and every restaurant, or every third mile off the interstate has a Waffle House, and there really is the waitress there who calls you hon and speaks with the funny accents. It's sort of a reminder that a lot of the stereotypes and a lot of the sort of the ideas and beliefs about the South, while often overstated and somewhat inaccurate in some ways, do have their roots in truth. And so I think I just sort of my sense from having grown up there and from having been around that is that Edwards would have, if not been a total game changer, he would have played well, and a lot of people would have opened up to him in a way that they wouldn't have been likely to open up to another Southern candidate. To another Democratic candidate.
But do you think, to give one of these patented, smooth, plugging head segues, that they will open up to Ron Paul? Or will they think he's a big racist?
Do I think that Southerners will...
I'm sort of kidding about the segue. We're going to talk about Ron Paul and the racism.
Yes.
How does Florida feel about the gold standard? What are we really talking about here?
I don't think Florida cares about the gold standard. I don't think, in fact, that most people care about the gold standard. It's sad for Ron Paul fans, anyway, who deeply, deeply care about the gold standard, which sort of baffles me in a lot of ways. But so obviously we know that we're all aware that a big article came out in the New Republic on Tuesday, I believe. Pointing out that Ron Paul has published a newsletter under his name with a lot of fairly offensive and, at the very least, very sketchy remarks about blacks, Jews, gays, pretty much anyone who's ever been discriminated against in America. This newsletter, which he did not sign any of the particularly offensive editions, but they did run under his name in the Ron Paul Political Report, mostly between 1988 and 1992, I believe. And so this has done a lot to deflate libertarianism and sort of the libertarian movement that Ron Paul spearheaded here, or at least that's sort of the argument. Looking at this from my perspective, I obviously was sympathetic to a lot of Ron Paul's ideas. Not all of them. I think he was wrong on trade and immigration and some of those things. But I was very sort of sympathetic to the set of ideas that he was purportedly standing for. So I'm disappointed. To begin with, I'm disappointed that he did not issue a stronger statement. It was kind of weird. That he just sort of dismissed this. Mm-hmm. That was one of the sort of baffling things about this, was that Ron Paul, all this stuff came out. Now, it's obviously a very big deal and going to sort of make an impact. And he issues this dismissive press statement that basically says those issues were taken care of a while ago, and I disagree with a lot of that stuff. It was written by a former staffer who's no longer with me, or something to that effect, and that's it. We're beyond this, and that's all. Sort of as if the campaign and as if Paul did not realize what a big deal this was and how people would take it. Even if they didn't think it was a big deal, it sort of just seemed odd that they didn't realize how big a deal this would be to everyone else. I mean, the New Republic servers were crashed. There were.
Well, I think they were crashed by Ron Paul fans, not by. Not by an electorate hungry for more Ron Paul commentary.
Sure, but when Ron Paul's fans go and crash the New Republic and then sort of light the fire under this story in the blogosphere, it's going to get a lot of coverage and a lot of pickup elsewhere. In the same way that everything else Ron Paul has done, despite not having any real serious showing in the polls ever anywhere, he's never. I think the best he's done was he was up at 10 or 11 for a little while in New Hampshire. He didn't even finish in double digits there, but he has because of the money and because of the attention been able to attract a lot of mainstream attention, and so when his fans go and sort of flock to something and pay attention to something, I think it has sort of it results in mainstream media notice. And he was on CNN the other day talking about this, and so there has been. I think there's been significant coverage of this, especially considering how minor a candidate he is in sort of the grand scheme of things.
He's a fascinating story, too. I mean, I think a big part of the issue with Paul, and a big explanatory factor in the relative serenity with which he greeted these allegations, was that this is a guy who's sort of comfortable on the fringe. And, a commenter of mine made the point that what the Ron Paul Coalition is disaffected former Naderites, libertarian voters, and pro voters. I mean, it is a coalition of the marginalized. And what they appreciate about Paul, I think, is that, he provides a warm, welcoming tent for them in a way that maybe the major parties don't. And also that he speaks to something within that mindset. I think some of the things Paul says are great. I mean, I love a lot of his comments on imperialism. I love his willingness to expand the debate in that direction in ways that the media finds abhorrent. I mean, it's fascinating to watch, folks like Giuliani attack him in the debates because he's never read Bin Laden because he says that Bin Laden, has a critique of our actual policies there. And, of course, it's Giuliani who's never read Osama Bin Laden, or at least is lying about what he says. So I have some respect for the Paul candidacy, and certainly think it's played a role that at times has been salutary. But Paul himself and the movement he's running is just sort of crack pottery. The fact that some of the crack pottery is useful crack pottery, and were there a better candidate espousing it, it would be a very compelling position. There's a coherent Ron Paul narrative. And it is about this idea of liberty, which is not just, a lot of people got into this movement because he's real anti-war, he's anti-imperialism, but there's a whole sort of constellation of concepts under the idea of liberty for him. They go everywhere from we shouldn't be giving Israel and the other Arab countries a ton of foreign aid money to we shouldn't have a minimum wage to you shouldn't be able to be forced to desegregate schools. It's possible, by the way, that I have that particular position of Paul's wrong, but I feel like he made on Meet the Press a pretty significant argument against the Civil Rights Act, which he said, failed on property rights grounds, and fair enough, but whether you are failing civil rights legislation because you care about property, because you care about racism, the end effect is the same. So I think Paul's a guy who's been, maybe as Matt or someone who pointed this out, very used to being dismissed in American politics, and so has quite a bit more sympathy for others who have also been shunted to the side, and so is willing to sort of abet these views and take them in their best form, or their most sympathetic form from their advocates, and not the form others give them. But I think it's a sad thing. I mean, I would like Paul. I feel this way about Dennis Kucinich, who does not have sort of the ugly views Paul has on some things, but I wish these fringe groups would have better candidates sometimes. I would like to hear what Kucinich and Paul have to say from candidates who are more attractive to the electorate. I think part of the reason
not
is...
the crypto racist and the space alien guy?
Right, I mean, right. I don't think Dennis Kucinich gives enough thought to how he represents the left. I think his candidacy is too much about him and not about the movement under him, partly given that the only thing he can really do is bolster them a bit, because he's not going to be the president. And I mean, maybe there's a structural reason, right? Maybe the reason better people don't go into it is that better, savvier candidates who have enough sort of charisma to run for president on these platforms sort of get brought in by the political establishment. They get, ideas that they could really win this thing, and so they begin compromising and moving more to the middle. So it's possible you just couldn't have it, that the reason Kucinich and Paul can be the way they are is because they are the way they are, and being disqualified for other reasons allows you to be braver on useful issues. But it's sort of the tragedy of Paul, and I think oftentimes the tragedy of the left, that our good ideas are wrapped up in people who also represent, bad ideas, who are unattractive to the electorate, or who've had a lot of sort of past indiscretions or problems. It's sort of a shame, because I'd like to see the debate expand.
Well, first of all, it's sort of to defend Paul at least a little bit on the segregation issue, he's not, he did at least say that he didn't think segregation was a good thing. He just didn't think that the way that it was ended was particularly the best way. So at the bare minimum, you can say he's not, sort of a defender of the idea of segregation as a good thing, qua good thing. But I think you get at something that's very right with what you say about sort of the Ron Paul coalition, which is that it's a coalition of the disaffected. And that's why, that's sort of one of the things that bothers me about sort of how the Ron Paul movement has been portrayed as this sort of libertarian uprising. It's not. It's an uprising of the disaffected. It's a movement of people who have felt cast out of mainstream politics and felt sort of unable to participate in the two-party system, sort of as it stands, and sort of in the mainstream world. And that's why a lot of the hate from that movement has been directed at the mainstream media, sort of mainstream politics. But the problem that comes out of that, at least from my perspective, is that what this means, though, is that that with all this stuff coming out about Ron Paul, it's going to tar libertarianism when his movement was never even really about libertarianism. He was never really, the candidate of the Cato Institute and Reason Magazine and some of this, sort of the libertarian institutions that sort of I think set the standard. And Chris Hayes again, had the piece about sort of the divisions in the libertarian movement. But there's a great argument, or at least a very reasonable argument. I think that Ron Paul is not really a libertarian, because with being against trade, being against immigration, and that sort of thing, and in sort of his sort of vague nationalist, sort of isolationist tendencies. Even if, yes, as his supporters have told me and everybody else, he is not an isolationist. And so what's going to come out of this, and sort of the sad thing that I think that comes out of this is that sort of libertarianism gets tarred, even though the Ron Paul coalition, the Ron Paul movement, was not about libertarianism, and was not it was about disenfranchisement and sort of
that's a fair point.
It was an outsider.
Now, what about a somewhat more potentially mainstream appealing Democrat? What is this new idea that Barack Obama is a libertarian?
There's a couple of things that have come out in the last couple of days. You've got you had the biggest one was a Daniel Koffler piece in The Guardian, and what Koffler argued was that that Barack Obama is a left libertarian. And is sort of follows along on the Brink-Lindsey libertarianism piece that came out a while back.
He does not do that.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'll give my disagreement a second. Please go on.
But it's based on the notion that Obama wants to create choice and opportunity rather than use the government to tell people what to do. So in his health care plan, as policy wonks have sort of argued about for the last couple of weeks, he does not have an individual mandate. He's also sort of he's pro-trade, things like that. And so the argument was that if that you can be that libertarians could support Obama because he has sort of because he wants to create choices, and because that's what libertarianism is about. And he sort of understands sort of that markets are a good thing and that growth is a good thing, and so he's creating he's allowing all of us to have more choices. I don't buy this argument at all. Obama's policies are not particularly libertarian in any way. Yes, he's pro-trade. Yes, his health care plan did not have a mandate. But anyone who's spent more than 15 minutes reading Cato at Liberty or Reason Magazine, talking to any of the editors there, no matter how much choice your government program provides, your government program is not a libertarian policy solution. Just because you dress up an elephant in a tutu doesn't make it a ballerina. They're not the same thing. But I can think of a couple of reasons that he might appeal to libertarians. And obviously the first is the war. He's been sort of the most vociferously anti-war candidate on the left. And there's a lot of anti-war sentiment amongst libertarians. And so I think they can appreciate that. But then if you also look at the poll numbers coming out of New Hampshire and see where Obama's support lies, it's largely in men. And it's largely in individuals making more than $50,000 a year. So more educated, wealthier men, which describes a lot of libertarians. And so they're going to there's, for whatever reason, there's an appeal to that group, and a lot of libertarians fall into that group. And he's also sort of he's more of a cosmopolitan candidate in a lot of ways. And there's at least amongst sort of the big city DC libertarians, there is sort of
the hipstertarians.
There's an appreciation for that sort of cosmopolitanism that he represents.
I liked reading the left libertarian version of Obama because I just couldn't help thinking that if this guy is so charismatic that he's going to get libertarians to diminish their ideology this much, to downgrade to set down the bar for libertarianism this far, then he's definitely got something to him. I mean, look, the mandate issue in the health care plan has nothing to do with growth. Obama's not even against mandates. He's got one for kids in there. And he said he's going to put one in for adults later. And in the meantime, he'd like to try using disincentives. So if you don't sign up for health care, then your premiums go way up. I mean, it's actually another way of saying mandate. It just is a little bit different. It was a decision of political expediency. He thought Edwards would be on the left and Hillary Clinton would be way to the right, and he'd be right there in the middle. I think it wasn't a decision that reflected well on his campaign, but it wasn't by any reporting I've done a lot of looking into this mandates issue. It wasn't a principled effort to show that mandates were against his philosophy, and he's gone to great lengths to tell me and others that he's open to them. What I think is interesting about the article is that Obama is good at containing multitudes, or at least getting multitudes to think he contains them. There are a lot of people who seem to want to project onto Obama their own ideologies. Andrew Sullivan, I think, disagrees with Obama on, everything.
Pretty close.
And particularly, by the way, on theories of... I agree. I understand that Andrew's now anti-Iraq war, but Andrew has a particular outlook on the American expansionism, the American state, imperialism, war, when it is just, when it is not. It is not a look that agrees with Obama, from what I can tell. Certainly, Andrew's beliefs on economic matters, on healthcare, etc., don't accord with Obama's, but Obama has a sort of charisma that, for at least a certain, cosmopolitan, as you put it correctly, I think, intellectual, makes him want to rationalize supporting his candidacy. and his candidacy has enough sort of like interesting little features and edges and Easter eggs that a lot of people from a lot of different parts of the ideological spectrum have been able to do that. But I really think the idea that this guy is in any way he is a significantly more progressive Democrat than we generally see running in elections. I mean, he's a significantly more progressive Democrat than Howard Dean was, a significantly more progressive Democrat than Joe Lieberman, a significantly more progressive Democrat than, for that matter, Hillary Clinton, than for that matter, John Kerry, than for that matter, Dick Gephardt. I understand that he's pro-trade, but there are very few Democrats, including John Edwards, by the way, who are not at this point. Trade is not a particularly contentious issue. I mean, it is contentious, but insofar as the actual policies that get put out by the party are, it doesn't end up, there's not a whole lot of protectionist result in what the Democrats attempt to enact. But I just find it fascinating. I think it's much more about, I think the fact that this article got written, and a couple weeks ago, by the way, I saw an article, I think it was in Bloomberg News, saying Obama was into behavioral economics, which is sort of a newer, cooler economics that I think is very interesting. But again, there's no evidence for in his policies. There's just an attempt to fit Obama into like new and fascinating political boxes, which will allow new and, heretofore unaffiliated folks to support him. And I think it says something interesting about his appeal. I think as we're seeing in New Hampshire, that doesn't mean he appeals as much as he and his supporters might hope to traditional political constituencies, but certainly to this sort of intellectual wine track voter, he's got something that is making them real desperate to line up behind him.
And I think you're absolutely right in all of that, and I think especially when you sort of talk about the way he's gotten libertarians to, or at least a few, because I've heard some sympathy for Obama from a number of libertarian types. But I think what that points out in a lot of ways that we're even having this discussion is sort of some of the weakness of the sort of limited of the libertarian movement and of some of the sort of limited government economic sentiments in the country right now. There is from my perspective, unfortunately, not a lot of support for that. And so I think the message to libertarians from seeing that in Obama and also from the Huckabee campaign and from these other things is that we have an awful lot of work to do, and that our message is not carrying all that well to the general public.
I think that's probably correct. I think we're running a little bit short on time here, so let's go to our final bit here. Folks out there in blogging headlines should know that Peter is among my favorite movie reviewers. I love his movie reviews. And
thank you.
So when I saw he was real into Juno, which I, having bad movie taste, was also very enamored with, I wanted to bring that up. And, I mean, there are two ways to do this conversation. I'll let you choose the route. We can talk about Juno and why it's an awesome movie, and oh my, is it ever a heartwarming and gladdening film. Or we can take the political line on it and talk about what it says about the role of abortion politics in America now, which I think is the cool way to discuss Juno, at least among political.
It may be the cool way to discuss Juno. I'm not sure the movie says a whole lot about the state of abortion politics in America right now. I think the reaction to the movie says a lot
that's a fair
about
point.
The state of abortion politics. To me, the film is not about abortion. It's in some ways it's not about the politics or physical stresses of pregnancy. Even it's about sort of decision making in relationships and sort of uses the pregnancy as a way to get at a lot of really sort of, I think, fairly subtle ideas about how people relate to each other, especially how young people relate to each other, and then also to adults in the world, and and sort of that weird state that's growing. I mean, we've seen a lot of what used to be associated with adolescence move into the decade, into people's 20s. People, who are 20 years old now, still have roommates, still have their starter jobs, and they live like college
roommates
kids.
never.
Right? And so what this gets at in a lot of ways is sort of that weird, that very weird place when you're 16, 17, and what sort of maturity level do we expect from 16 and 17-year-olds? What kind of responsibility do we expect from them, and how do we expect them to relate to their parents, to 30-ish couples, to their friends, and sort of so to me it's more of an exploration of sort of a particular time of life than it is a particularly political film. On the other hand, because abortion is sort of a central choice at the beginning of the film, it's gotten written up as a movie about abortion. Didn't help that we had Knocked Up come out this year, which sort of
seemed like a trend,
which had already sort of started the discussion. But if you look at the movie, what's the movie's position on abortion? Well, the movie's position on abortion is that she chose not to have one for reasons that are somewhat unclear, and so that we could have a movie. Because if she had gone and had an abortion, would there have been that would have had to been at the sort of the end of the film, and they wanted to make a film about the struggle here, and about sort of the choices that you make, and then the responsibilities of being 16 and 17 years old.
I think a big part of it, and you get this right, is that the movie was not only not about abortion, it was to a shocking degree not about pregnancy.
She didn't get sick in the morning.
It was the easiest pregnancy
there
I've
was just
ever
so
heard of.
little of the sort of the pregnancy dilemma. It was about, well, how is she going to tell her parents, and then what are her parents going to say, and then how is she going to relate to the yuppie couple who are thinking about adopting her child, and how is she going to talk to her friends, her boyfriend, the other kids at school?
But I think it wasn't about how she talked to her boyfriends and the other kids at school. I mean, in a weird way, it really downplayed the relationships between Juno and her peers. I mean, the Michael Cera subplot, and I'm a big Michael Cera fan.
Right. Okay, you're right.
It was very lax, and it was actually the part of the movie with the biggest plot holes. I mean, they're best friends, but she didn't see him in 3 months and didn't know about this prom thing. I mean, it's a little unclear what the relationship really consisted of by that point.
Yeah, he's definitely the most undeveloped character in the film.
What was interesting to me about it was that the underlying anxiety of the movie was not about pregnancy, was not about raising children. It was a teenager and a 20-something, and the writer of the movie, Diablo Cody, it's possible she's gone into her 30s, but I think she's in her 20s, and, very much in this sort of extended creative, post-college teenage period. It was about the anxiety that we're not going to be able to make this work in the way that that a lot of young people look around and think their parents weren't able to make it work. I thought that one of the way Juno experienced her own pregnancy, and I thought one of the much more telling parts of the film came towards the end when, the couple, and this is a spoiler alert, and if people haven't seen this movie and are going to, you should turn off Blogging Heads and go, look at
and you should see the movie
under them, or whatever people do on the internet. But she comes home, after the yuppie couple sort of appeared out of their falling out, and goes to her father, and what really scares her isn't, Dad, what am I going to do with my baby? That doesn't actually come up in a fascinating way. It was, please tell me the two people can be together and not have it fall apart. I mean, the fear was about the ability to sustain healthy and loving relationships. It had nothing to do with children. I mean, it was almost amazing. I thought that was it was an interesting and telling choice on Cody's part, or maybe it wasn't even a choice. Maybe it's really was an expression of what she wanted to get at, and in that way wasn't something she ever had to choose between. But she didn't. It was just this remarkably weird conversation where it looks like Juno may have to keep this kid, and instead of being worried about that, she comes up to her father and says, "Tell me the two people can stay together."
Right.
Because that's what is a sort of that is the fear driving the movie, that people won't find love. I mean, the family stuff is so beside the point. Juno's pregnancy is merely a way to allow her, it is a vehicle to allow her to navigate the landscape of adult relationships, to come into contact with different models, to think about what that would be like. She wants to give her kid to a cool couple, not a lame couple. She, what is her father and his stepmother like? And in that way, I thought it was it tapped into something deeper than maybe people are giving it credit for, because As far as I know, among the folks I'm friends with, and I can only speak from my demographic space, and it's a limited one, no doubt about that. But like, this is the animating fear. People think a lot less about children, and their thoughts about children are a lot less complicated than their thoughts about, will I be able to do this better than it looks to me like my parents did?
You're right, and I think it's very telling that sort of there was. The film separates children from relationships, and it sort of works off that thing that's happened in recent years, which is that children are no longer the thing that connects people in relationships, and are no longer what holds them together. I don't remember where I was reading this the other day, but I read an article that sort of made the point that that marriage is no longer about raising children, and it's simply about finding something sort of self-fulfilling and sort of a good relationship, and that's what the film is about. But it sort of really makes that point in a very smart way, that children are no longer what hold together these things, these relationships, and then sort of asks the question, well, what does? And I'm not sure it comes up with a great answer, but it provides us with a whole sort of slate of possible answers, none of which are quite satisfying, and the film seems sort of
right
as lost as many people these days seem to be about what it is that's supposed to hold those things together.
Mm-hmm. I think that's correct, but it's a very fun film, by the way. It's a very good movie, and I think all of you Blogging Heads people should see it. It is very. I saw that, and one of the other sort of
we're going to use the
movies to see
big
here.
Push and pull of Blogging Heads here.
Right, No Country for Old Men. I saw them one day apart from each other, and it's like the matter and antimatter of movies. Like, one is so unrelentingly grim, and Juno is so
delightfully upbeat in a lot of ways.
Soaringly pleased and upbeat and cheerful. It's a fascinating film like that. But I think we're at an hour here, so we should probably cut it short. You got any final closing thoughts?
Nope, just go see No Country and Juno if you haven't.
All right. Peter, thank you very much.
Nice talking to you, Ezra.
Cheers.